Just wanted to welcome you all to the 2016 State Innovation Exchange Annual Legislative Summit. We were reflecting yesterday with some staff. Yeah, you can give a round of applause. We were reflecting yesterday with some of the staff who were in the first meeting a couple years ago, and we had about 100 people in the room. This year, we've quadrupled it. We have well over 400 legislators from across the country who have come. And it's important because we really are at a critical crossroads in this country, especially for progressives. Right now, Donald Trump is the president-elect of the United States. Conservatives control majorities in the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. At the state level, conservatives control 33 governorships. That's the most since the early 1920s. They have 29 attorneys generals. That's the most in American history. They have 68 state legislative chambers. That's also the most since the early 1920s. And as I mentioned last night, with the loss of the Kentucky House, progressives no longer control one legislative chamber in the entire South. And you can count on one hand the number of statewide elected officials in the South. Now we're about to go into a discussion about what happened and why we have gotten ourselves into the place we are. And I don't know about you, but I've been hearing a lot of theories. It was racism. Progressives have ignored the white working class. People are dumb. It's the millennials' fault. Secretary Clinton was a flawed candidate. It was the FBI. It was the Russians. It was because of the Electoral College. It was everyone's fault but our own. But as progressives, we must take some accountability. Those of you who've been working at the state and local level, all of you in this room have seen the writing on the wall. Where we are now is not something that just happened overnight. It's been in the making for nearly a generation, and progressives have basically been asleep at the wheel. While we have been spending billions of dollars on trying to hold on to and control federal power, right under our noses, conservatives have been quietly investing and building in an infrastructure at the state level that has been chipping away at progressive power for at least 40 years. Think about this. In 1974, just before the Watergate scandal and President Nixon's resignation, Democrats had full control of 37 legislatures. Republicans controlled 5, and 7 were split. Today, that number has basically flipped. What happened? Well, since about 1974, conservatives have decided to get serious about how they could change the power dynamics in this country. They followed the advice of Lewis Powell. Yeah, that Lewis Powell, who eventually became a Supreme Court justice. He was a consultant for the business community. And he outlined a plan in a memo now referred to as the Powell Memo, which focused on power building locally from the ground up. What evolved from this thinking was a constellation of conservative organizations that focused on elections, ideas promotion, training, and grassroots organizing. This includes groups like the Republican State Leadership Committee, which focuses on elections. They coordinate messaging through an organization called the Franklin Center, who has affiliates now in most states. Organizing comes through groups like Americans for Prosperity, and idea generation through groups like the Heritage Foundation. That infrastructure, coupled with 2 groups in particular, the State Policy Network and the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, create this network of in-state resources that go to advance their agenda in the states. And what do you think these groups have focused on? Well, first, they focus on and win elections at the state level. Take what happened prior to 2010. Conservatives launched something called the Red Map Project, which was a plan hatched by Ed Gillespie that focused on flipping state legislative chambers in enough key states, especially purple states in the Rust Belt, Midwest, and Florida, That year, they spent about $30 million on races in those states and just blew Democratic incumbents out of the water and recaptured control of those state capitals. What they did there allowed them to control redistricting and redraw both state and federal lines in a way that built a conservative firewall in the House of Representatives. Let me put that $30 million in perspective for you. This year, the Indiana Senate race cost $30 million. So for the same amount of money that we've spent trying to elect Evan Bayh in Indiana, Republicans control the state House and gain control of the House of Representatives for a decade. How about that for priorities and strategy? That's just the beginning. They not only invest in races, they also invest in other groups I mentioned who train, care, and feed for legislators when they are in office. It's a two-pronged strategy that is an important symbiotic relationship in the life of an elected official. And in fact, many more resources are put into this strategy than just getting people elected. You know why? Because this strategy of caring and feeding of elected officials pays enormous dividends. First, they're able to build a farm team. We've lost, since 2008, 900 state legislative seats. Think about what that means for the farm team, for electeds for office. There's a reason we are dusting off Evan Bayh and Ted Strickland and some of these people to run again. It's because we don't have anyone else. We need to invest in young elected officials. Yesterday, we had a training for about 70 young elected officials who are newly elected. That's where it begins. That's where we should start. Think about the presidential election. They had a clown car of candidates, but it was a clown car filled with people who were relatively diverse. They were relatively young. They were from the states. Most were governors. Who are we organizing ourselves around? Two white 70-year-olds. And the next best person was our vice president, who is amazing, but he's 70 years old. Why is that? Second, with control of legislative chambers, they are able to control policymaking. So while we are focused on trying to make changes from DC, conservatives are able to push their agenda in states across the country. Alec writes the bills, the business community gets behind it and lobbies on behalf of it, and they're able to move an agenda through the states. Think about what happened with Stand Your Ground. It started in Florida, but then moved to 20-some states in 1 year. In 1 year. Third, when you're on the offense on policymaking, you can also control message and the narrative. There was a lot made about how progressives failed to connect to and hear the concerns of people in the country. Is that surprising? When your entire strategy centers on what's going inside DC, you're going to miss what's happening in the real world. When you don't listen to people or elected officials in the cities and states, people who are closest to the people, you end up developing platforms and strategies that are completely tone deaf. Meanwhile, conservatives invest money and time in building narratives locally and infusing language in the American psyche. Think about what happens when we talk about immigration reform. What is the first thing every president, every politician says? We're a nation of laws, and we need to secure the border first. Why do you think that happens? Because in the states, for over a decade, they have beaten that message into people's minds. If anything, the Trump election should create a course correction for progressives. The strategy and focus must begin at the state and local level. It is the only way forward, and anyone who has any other ideas is either trying to hold on to their position of power or doesn't know what they're talking about. But there's good news, and it begins and ends with each of you in this room. I have to tell you, as I mentioned yesterday, for weeks I've been depressed, not sleeping, lashing out, drinking too much, eating too much. But I'm telling you right now, I feel a lot of hope. I want to fight. and I want to win. We have the pieces in place. We don't necessarily need to throw everything out. We just need deeper investments in all of it, from donors, funders, and the broader progressive movement. We have each of you in this room, progressive-minded elected officials, and thousands of like-minded people around this country who are ready. I know you're ready. We also have SiX. With less than half of the resources that I mentioned conservatives have, we've grown our network to over 1,500 state legislators in all 50 states. Last year, we coordinated a week of action where 24 states introduced equal pay legislation around the country. This was the first time this level of coordination occurred for progressives, and this year, as you know, we're going to focus our coordination around an economic agenda that will allow all of us, all of you, to lead and draw contrasts with what will be coming out of Donald Trump and the conservatives in Washington. The one thing, though, that I would ask from all of you, and I would ask you to spread the word about, is that it is time now to coalesce together around a common strategy in the states. People in Washington are finally, all of a sudden, discovering that you all exist. This is a good thing in some ways, but my fear is that people who don't know what they're doing are going to go running into the states and cause confusion, try to tell you what to do. They'll have some resources, but just be careful. We can't let ourselves do that. We have to be strategic, and we have to be organized. Don't let ALEC divert you. And frankly, don't let other progressive groups who don't know what they're doing divert you. If that's happening, please reach out, check with us. I have been in state and local politics since 1997, and my first job was in the Nebraska unicameral, my home state. I hear one whistle from Nebraska, thank you. I promise you, and our staff is has worked at the state level for a long time. They know what they're doing. We know what we're doing, and we want to work with you and stand by you. We will be with you every step of the way. We're not going to go anywhere. We're only growing. In the past 2 years, we've grown from a staff of 5 to 15. We have 3 offices in DC, Madison, and Denver. And we're only going to get bigger and stronger. And our job and what we do on a day-to-day basis is work with you. We're in your states, and we will be with you every step of the way. We can do this, but we need the entire movement to get serious and refocus our time, energy, and resources building and investing in people like you. We need to stick together, and I promise we have your back, and I know you have ours. It's time to lead. We need each of you now more than ever. I believe our lives and our children's lives literally depend on it. Thank you. We'll start now the formal program. And I want to start by introducing a friend of mine, David Brock. He is somebody who will be staying in this fight and will be standing with us, investing in state strategies. As many of you know and have heard, he's putting together a group of donors over inaugural weekend to come and pool funds together that we hope and will go to state-based strategies, to groups like SiX. He'll talk a little bit about that. But we asked him to come also and provide his perspective on what happened in 2016. As you know, he had a unique perch as one of the closest advisors to Secretary Clinton. He is also someone who understands better than most the conservative network and their investment in state infrastructure. I've admired David for what he has done to fight against Fox News and the conservative media complex. His groups, American Bridge, Correct the Record, and Media Matters, have been incredibly important pieces of the progressive infrastructure. And I think will become even more so with Donald Trump as president. So please join me in welcoming David Brock. Thank you.